This episode of the Outdoor Life podcast is brought to you by Vortex Optics.
The turkey hunters of America need a biology lesson. There are just so many little things that we as hunters don't really understand about turkeys. Like, why exactly do toms gobble at owls? And then why do those same gobblers go silent the moment they hit the ground? And does the camo pattern we choose to wear even really matter? But then there are some much bigger questions facing turkey hunters too. Like, why are wild turkey populations seemingly declining in so many places? And equally important, what should game agencies and turkey hunters do about it? The best man to answer these questions is Dr. Mike Chamberlain, a distinguished professor at the University of Georgia who's been researching wild turkeys for the past 30 years. But Mike is also a die-hard turkey hunter, and he has a real knack for explaining scientific theories and ideas in a way that regular hunters, like you and me, can actually understand. I'm Editor-in-Chief Alex Robinson, and just ahead of this turkey season, I sat down with Mike to ask him the turkey biology questions that all of us should probably have the answers to. Let's just start really basic turkey biology or zoology, and just give us some kind of interesting facts or some details about a wild turkey's senses. Their vision, their hearing. Maybe a little background on some stuff that not all hunters know about the wild turkey.
Yeah, sure. So their vision and hearing kind of go. They're the double-edged sword that cuts us turkey hunters pretty deeply. So they see, their vision is entirely different than ours. We see through monocular vision, right? So we look at things and we can judge distances very accurately. We can see depth, and our eyes work in concert. But what actually turkeys have is they have monocular vision. And it's periscopic. And what that means is each eye functions independently. So you have two single eyes, and if you pay attention to turkeys, they turn their head constantly. And that offers them, because their eyes are working independently, that offers them a 360 degree field of view. Whereas you and I, we sit and I'm looking at you, you're looking at me, and we have peripheral vision, but we can't see behind us. We can't see above us, but turkeys can. And that's why they change their head posture constantly, because they're allowing those eyes to pick up movement as two independent periscopes, which is pretty interesting. And then you factor in their hearing, and their hearing, they use their hearing to augment their vision, because they have more photoreceptors in their eyes than we do, but they don't have the same rod and cone sequence. So what that means is they can see colors, but they see colors very differently than you and I do.
Okay.
So their hearing is the same in the sense that when a sound comes in one ear, they don't have a flap on their ears like we do. They just have an ear canal. Well, when that sound comes in, each ear registers the sound independently and transmits that to their brain. And what that does, coupled with their vision, so they hear something, they look in that direction, and they turn their head constantly, what that allows is for them to pinpoint where that sound's coming from, because the two ears are working independently. So it's a little bit louder over here on this ear than that ear. I'll turn my head constantly, and that will allow those ears to tell my brain how far that sound is away from me. And that's why they have that uncanny ability. You call at them, you call at them in the tree, and 10 minutes later, they're standing at the tree with you. They know exactly where that sound came from. And that's why, because of the way their eyes and their ears function.
Yeah. Now, turkeys, is it true that turkeys see on the UV spectrum? I hear that a lot. Is that true? And if so, what does that mean exactly?
There's some debate about that. What we do know is that turkeys, their vision is right on the line between, UV and not.
Okay.
Regardless, their vision is extremely acute because of that, where they are on that spectrum, which is why they can pinpoint movement so well. They can pinpoint colors, so well. So, blues and blacks and things in their environment that may not look right, they pick it out immediately because of the photoreceptors in their eyes and how they function. So, and that's also why turkeys, they don't have good night vision. Their night vision is quite poor because their eyes are designed to pull in the light, and they have such acute day vision that's at the expense of not having good night vision.
Gotcha.
So that's yet another reason why turkeys sleep in trees, because they can't see well at night.
Yeah, they don't want to be roaming around on the ground when they can't see. When it comes to like what hunters should make of that, like does it make sense just from like kind of a scientific standpoint to try to blend your clothing to the environment that you're in? And does it make sense to wear face paint or a face mask all the time? These are kind of the things that we just believe as turkey hunters, but I'm curious to know from a scientific standpoint, does that stuff make sense?
Yeah, I'm on the side of I try to blend as naturally as I can into whatever environment I'm hunting in. But in many ways, I think it's more of an artifact of the angle at which the bird comes to you and whether you move. Because the way they see, or, we can't ask a turkey how their vision works, but what we think is, if a bird's looking directly at you, you look very different sitting against a tree or standing against a tree than you do if he or she gets to where you're silhouetted. You don't look normal as part of the environment, regardless of what you're wearing.
Right.
So I tend to be one that I really don't want the bird to see me move. And if you do, you're hosed. I mean, they're gone. I try to blend in. That being said, I hunted with a guy last year that refused to wear a face mask. And I killed a bird with him sitting beside me. And I was pretty mad. I mean, I was on this hunt, and he was just like a quote unquote guide. He took us out, and I did all my own calling and everything. We were doing a video, and he just refused to. He wouldn't wear gloves or face mask, but he didn't move. And he was 5 feet from me when I shot a bird at 30 yards. So I think there's probably some things we don't fully understand about what they see and what alarms them.
Yeah.
Prior to that occurrence, I was, and I still am. I don't wear face paint because it's just a pain to get off. But I'm that guy that wears a face mask that you can't see anything but his eyes.
No, I'm the same. But I know that there are some guys who aren't, and they seem to do fine too. So, that definitely some mystery there still. How about on our favorite, every turkey hunter's favorite part of the hunt, which is the wild turkey gobble? What are a couple things about, gobbling turkeys that, maybe from like a biological standpoint, more hunters would benefit from knowing about?
Well, by default, most gobbling is supposed to be near their roost, which most of us we experience when we turkey hunt. I think a lot of hunters get frustrated when birds get quiet, during the day, but that's what they're supposed to do. The gobble, the reason they gobble is there's several underlying mechanisms there. One, they're obviously trying to attract attention, but they're also trying to let each other know that they're still there. They're maintaining their relationships with other males when they gobble. Hey, I'm still over here. you're still over there. You can stay over there, type of thing.
Right.
So once they get a response from the other birds in the environment, if they know where hens are going to be or they have hens, it doesn't make any sense for them to gobble once they get on the ground. So really, most gobbling is supposed to be around the roost site, and then they're supposed to kind of shut up a little bit and not be so obnoxious. The other thing I think is interesting to hunters is how many other sounds are in the same frequency band of a gobble. And we record gobbling activity with these remote listening devices. And then we have a machine learning tool that goes through and pulls all the gobbles out. But it also pulls out other sounds that are in that same frequency because it can't tell the difference between a gobble and, say, a gunshot. And if you think about it, I'll name some of them: a gunshot, a coyote howl, a Canada goose honk, a barred owl, a crow. And think about all the things that stimulate a bird to gobble, and everything I just listed is in that list. So it does appear that a lot of the sounds that prompt a bird to gobble, in his ear, it's right in his wheelhouse, if you will, of his hearing. It's in the same frequency that he's hearing other gobbles and hens that are yelping are both in that same frequency band, which is, in my eyes, that's why he gobbles to those other sounds.
Gotcha. So that the old, gobbling at an owl hoot. I've had every new turkey hunter I take asks me, like, why do turkeys gobble at owls? Like, why are we doing an owl call to get turkeys to gobble? And I just tell them basically the same thing that, veteran turkey hunters told me when I started hunting, which is that owls and turkeys are kind of, adversarial. They're kind of enemies. So turkeys just gobble at them. Is that not true? Like, what, you think it's more of a frequency thing? That's why they're gobbling at owl hoots?
It is, yeah. So like barred owls are largely irrelevant to turkeys.
Yeah.
Now horned owls, they will kill turkeys, but the owls that you're talking about, we're making barred owl calls. Right. No, I don't think it's any adversarial. I think it's in that frequency band, so it prompts them to respond to it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So when we're like really critiquing each other's owl hoots and really going in deep on that, kind of all we have to do is get in the right frequency, and that should work fine for getting a turkey to gobble.
It should, yeah. Which, think about people that are, I've used one of my favorite locator calls is a Canada goose call.
Yeah.
And I'm a okay goose caller. I do okay when I goose hunt. I'm certainly not Fred Zink or somebody that, but I can get by with it. And I don't think the turkeys care. Yeah. It's in that frequency, so they respond to it or not. And this as well as I do. You can hoot all you want some days, and he's not going to respond to it, and other days he will.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, now pulling back, zooming out a little bit farther from just like the specific turkey biology. Let's talk about like habitat and a turkey's needs a little bit. What are some kind of underrated habitat features that wild turkeys need to survive and thrive?
Yeah, in some ways it depends on where you are on the planet, but in a general sense, if you look at turkeys across the year, their fall and winter is tied to food. That's all they're worried about, is surviving and eating. So if you're in the eastern subspecies or Osceola subspecies range, oak hickory forest, hardwood forests that have acorns. In other parts of that same range, agricultural properties, waste grains, feedlots, something that gives birds that fall winter food. And if you go out west, you talk about Merriam's and Rios, there's some of those same things, but you'll also, see birds maybe be more closely tied to feedlots, livestock operations, anywhere where they can get food during the winter. And then unlike some other species, what you see with turkeys is as soon as they come out of winter, they use completely different habitats. They change, we call it like the spring shift, if you will. And what that looks like in, say, the eastern part of the country is, you've got turkeys on your property in the winter, and then suddenly they're gone. And they're 2 miles down the road, at your neighbor's place. And the reason for that is they tend to go back to the same places every year to breed. They tend to have, certain roosts. So, for instance, an eastern tom may have 5 or 10 roosts in his home range that he uses. And that, whereas a Rio may have 2 in his home range. But the bottom line is they all tend to shift to habitats that are more open in the spring, where they can see, where they can display, where they can feed on insects and green forage. And then obviously, hens are then looking for nesting habitat. They're looking for a little thicker, a little denser, shrubbier, brushier, grassy areas where they can hide themselves in their nest. But they are only tied to that for that 1 month. Mm-hmm. And then they go back to using open, more open habitats where they can see after nesting season if they have a brood or if they don't have a brood. And then you kind of see them rinse and repeat that annual cycle every year. So you see really dramatic differences in what a turkey requires from, say, October or November to April. It almost changes full circle.
So, just generally speaking, like late fall, winter months, really like kind of food oriented, just like trying to get in places where they can get easy access to high quality foods and cover. And then in the spring, that shifts to going to areas where they can display and be part of the mating cycle.
That's right.
Kind of in that cycle during the springtime, like how important of a factor is food? Just for like, kind of turkey hunters to key in on, like, should they kind of be looking at food sources the same way that deer hunters look at food sources during the rut? Is like a food source will kind of attract does, which will then potentially attract a buck? Or does it work differently in the turkey world?
Yeah, what you see with turkeys is somewhat similar than what you just described. But what you tend to see with toms is they're going to areas where they can interact with hens, period. Mm-hmm. And most of the time, if you think about it from a hen's perspective, she wants to breed, but she also is preparing for nesting. So she's stocking up on resources. She's taking care of herself. She's increasing her fat stores. She's getting ready to produce those eggs. So she's really concerned with, I'm going to breed, but I'm also going to get myself in the best possible physical condition that I can so that I can sit on that nest for a month and eat much less than I'm currently eating. Well, by default, if he's hanging around with her, he's going to end up in some areas with high quality forage. But what I've noticed with toms, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing, is they seem oblivious to food for hours and hours and hours. And then all of a sudden you'll get a bird that he takes a break from what he's doing and he gorges himself on something that's available to him. And you see this sometimes in birds that you kill. If you open their crop and it's packed full of one flower, and other toms you'll kill, they'll have 10 different things in there. But I've killed a number of birds where it was dominated by one thing, particularly birds I shot in the afternoon, that, they got into something at some time prior to me shooting them that afternoon and found something that was available and they ate it until they were full. which makes sense, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any kind of like food sources that you think turkey hunters should maybe pay a little more attention to in the springtime?
Anything that's attracting insects, any succulent green, you know, and I know that may sound goofy because a lot of things are succulent and green in the spring, but what insects are going to do is they're going to track succulent forage. So as vegetation becomes more rank, they're going to move and go use something else. So turkeys they're not only eating insects in the spring, they're eating seeds and green forage, but they're also consuming insects because insects are a primary source of protein for them. And as soon as the spring season is over, turkeys replace their body feathers. They molt.
Okay.
So they molt in the summer. Well, to support molting, you got to have insects. You have to have protein to grow those feathers back. So that's one. Another one that I've personally noticed, and I think it's linked to insects, is showy, attractive flowers. Areas that have green vegetation, but also have flowers that are attracting insects, flying insects. Those can be pretty jam up because the bird shows up and they can eat the flowers, but they can also work on the insects that are attracted to the flowers.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, this is Rob, Director of Product Development at Vortex. I want to tell you about the new Defender CCW. It's the rugged, easy-to-use red dot specifically built for everyday carry. Drop-proof, direct mount with no modifications. We get a ton of questions and feedback about red dots for micro and compact pistols. The Defender CCW is the result. Best-in-class window size, glass quality, and durability. Head on over to vortexoptics.com to learn more, or read about it in the Outdoor Life article, Building the Ultimate Concealed Carry Gun.
All right, now let's zoom back even farther. There's been a lot of discussion all over turkey country about declining populations, places in the southeast, big time turkey hunting states, but also, some places in the Midwest and Northeast too. And I think there's a lot of folks kind of trying to figure out, one, what's going on, and two, what to do about it. But before we get into any of that stuff, would you help put some of these discussions in context a little bit? Like, is it possible that like the wild turkey in America is in trouble? Or is it more likely that, we're seeing these kind of localized turkey population declines in certain places, but that's kind of natural. And in other places, we're seeing turkey populations increase. So it all is just kind of naturally part of a cycle of, ups and downs. What do you make of that?
I think there's a little of both there. There's no question that birds are struggling in some areas, particularly in the southeast, parts of the Midwest. The research has clearly shown that they're just not as productive as they were a few decades ago. We're not making as many young turkeys as we were. There are a variety of reasons for that. The biggies, if you will, the tops would be just dramatic declines in habitat quality and availability, coupled with, we've essentially created ideal predator habitat in a lot of wild turkey range. We have fragmented forest. We have converted forests from hardwoods to pine or other land uses. We've removed habitat for urbanization and development. And so if you kind of look at the United States now versus, say, 20 years ago, it's just not as quote-unquote good as it was for turkeys. And some of the increases that we saw decades ago were an artifact of restoration. We were moving turkeys everywhere, and those populations exceeded carrying capacity, which many do when you restore an animal to vacant habitat, a lot of times they'll do that. They'll kind of overshoot their carrying capacity. And the problem we have now is it appears that in many areas, turkeys are maintaining themselves at a level that's just not high enough for what we want to support the level of harvest that we want to see to ensure quality hunting. People want to hear turkeys, and if they go and they don't hear turkeys, that's a problem. On the flip side, there are some areas where turkeys appear to be doing quite well. There's, much of the Northeast, some areas in the upper Midwest seem to be doing well. Now, there are those in the scientific community, myself included, that are skeptical that will continue, because what we've seen pretty much across the species range in areas where there are enough data there to make an inference that the populations have declined over the past few decades. So I think we're probably going to be looking at declines in other states where things appear to be good now. And I'm already hearing some anecdotal, outfitters and landowners in areas like parts of Wisconsin that have contacted me saying, my birds have declined by 50% in the past decade. And so I think what you're seeing is pretty much across at least the eastern part of the United States is things have declined. We pretty much know what the causes are. What we do about it is a challenge, because most turkeys live on private land.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's private landowners and how they manage their properties will dictate the future of this species.
Yeah.
And that's a challenge, obviously.
Let's get into one of those kind of specifics. One of the things that you mentioned is poult production. That's one of the more you've highlighted in presentations for NWTF and, in other articles and podcasts, like you've highlighted kind of a trending decline in poult production in a whole bunch of states. And that's one of the more alarming, points to me. So could you kind of explain why we're seeing a decline in poult production and what possibly we might do about that?
Yeah, there's two things that are driving that, and they're not really mutually exclusive. One is the percentage of nests that are hatching is simply lower than it has been historically.
Okay, so explain that. Like the hens laying eggs and the poults just aren't hatching out of them?
The nests are being destroyed, yes.
Gotcha.
So what we see is most nests fail. That's the bottom line. The percentage that do hatch in some of our areas is literally below 20%. And in other areas it can be, 25%. But the bottom line is most nests fail. And the primary cause of failure is predation of either the female, but more often the eggs themselves. So we're not hatching as many birds as we need to. That's one. The other thing that we're seeing, which is impactful, is once they hatch, poult survival or brood survival appears to be very low. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One of the big ones that I see when I travel is that there's an overwhelming lack of brood habitat in many areas. And brood habitat is very, very specific compared to nesting habitat. Nesting habitat is literally turkeys will nest in all sorts of places.
Sure. Yeah, I found turkey nests just randomly in the woods. Just some spot in the woods.
Yeah, and we don't see any link between what it looks like and whether they hatch or not. I mean, we've been studying that for decades, and it doesn't appear that how thick the vegetation is or any of that matters. It appears that it's more of a random process, that if she happens to lay that clutch in an area where there are a lot of raccoon activity or whatever, then she's probably going to lose the nest. Brood habitat, on the other hand, is very specific. It doesn't matter what part of the species range you're in. You have to be able to see. They have to be able to see. So imagine if you want to see the world from a poult's perspective, lay on your stomach. That's what they see. And if you look around you laying on your stomach, you need to be able to run very quickly and hide under something. But you have to be able to see in front of you. So imagine if you kind of think about that, it needs to be clumpy, patchy, think open grasses, shrub here and there, wide open vision. So think a hen needs to be able to stand there. So imagine about knee height, and she needs to be able to see everywhere at knee height around her.
Yeah.
And if you just, and I would challenge people to do this, just go out to properties that you hunt or anywhere in your environment and look at the world that way. And you will see what I see. There's not a lot of that. Yeah. And it's because, and I'm generalizing here. I mean, there are some places that I see tremendous brood habitat. Some of the, like for instance, some of the places I hunt in South Dakota, it's open prairies. They're just beautiful. I mean, there's just beautiful habitat in some of those areas, and there's a lot of turkeys. But when I travel, at least mostly in the Southeast, I don't see much brood habitat.
Yeah.
And when I go to places where bird broods that we're monitoring as part of our work, when I go to places where we know with certainty the brood was here at 1:00 yesterday, when I look at that place and what it looks like, that doesn't look like most of the landscape. It's very different. And if you kind of, I'm 51 years old. I can remember as a kid, as a teenager, driving around and walking and hunting in forest, and there was a lot of disturbance. There was, I could see a lot. And now you drive around and everything looks thicker to me. Everything is more dense. If you look at kind of, private landowners, timber companies, for instance, used to use prescribed fire routinely. They don't often now. If you look at, ownership patterns of private lands in a lot of parts of the East, the parcels are getting smaller and smaller and smaller because larger tracts are being sold. So you may go from, a 2,000 acre piece of property that's managed fairly well in the 1990s, and it's sold in the 2000s, and now it's 10 different tracts.
Yeah.
And 9 of them are not managed at all. They're just custodial managed. They just sit there.
Right.
And what that does is it creates a landscape that's just more, it's thicker. It's not as well managed, and that's what I see when I drive around and walk around many areas that turkeys live.
So if you're a private landowner, a hunter who owns some ground, and you're listening to this, what's just like some easy stuff that you can do, some projects that you can do yourself to try to help poult production and better brood habitat?
You have to give the birds the ability to see. Mm-hmm. That's what I tell people. Any tool that you have that will help you create or maintain open vegetation, and what I mean by open is knee high or less. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If it's up to your waist when you're walking through it, that's not turkey habitat.
Yeah.
Will they use that? Yes, if they have to. But their number one survival tool is vision. If they can see, that helps them, versus if they can't see as well, it helps the predator.
Yeah.
So I tell people, anything you have, any tool you have that can open up the forest, mm-hmm. that can make it more visible, do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Gotcha. And how does that kind of go hand in hand with habitat for deer management, like timber stand improvement type of stuff? Do those things work pretty well together, or is it really two different approaches?
It starts out pretty much benefiting both. So you go, let's say you go into a forest, let's just say a hardwood dominated forest. You go in and you do TSI and you remove some of the trees that are competing with your oaks, and you open up the understory, sunlight gets to the ground. That initially benefits both deer and turkeys.
Right.
The disconnect, it happens down the road when that understory is not managed and it gets denser and denser and denser.
Yep.
At that point, it's still okay for deer because of the way their behavior is driven, which is when they're scared, they run and hide.
Yeah.
And when turkeys, they don't do that. They see. They stand there and watch, and then they run.
Yeah.
So that's where, like TSI, that's where the disconnect with deer and turkeys comes, is down the road if it's not managed.
Yeah, because deer do like that thick cover, to disappear in. And you're saying that that's not always the best for turkeys in the woods.
Yeah, I liken it think about like a food plot. You plant a food plot. If you're a deer hunter, where do you think about planting if you had an ideal scenario, where would you plant your food plots? You plant them near bedding cover, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, near some thick areas where they could just pop out. They wouldn't have to travel.
Yeah, they don't have to go far. They can just come right out to it. Yeah.
When you're thinking food plots for a turkey, they need to be able to see out of the plot. They need to be able to see all of the forest around that plot, because if they're looking into a wall, then that benefits the predator. Whereas that actually helps a deer, because a deer something can say spook the deer off the food plot, and they run into the forest and they hide. They stop.
Yep.
As soon as they get to where it's thick enough.
Yeah. They go 50 or 75 yards back there and they're good as gone.
Yeah.
They just stand there, but they're disappeared. So
turkeys, they want to be able to run into that forest and it be open enough to where they can still see as they're running.
Yeah.
So fundamentally, they look at their environment very differently than deer do.
Gotcha. That's interesting. How about on the hunting side? This is probably the part that seems to get talked about the most these days and is the most kind of controversial in terms of when hunting seasons are, bag limits, even hunting tactics that we're applying these days. That's the stuff that really gets people going. But just from a data standpoint, what does research show? What have you found about how hunting pressure impacts wild turkeys, kind of individually, but then also on a more regional population standpoint?
Yeah, so individually what we found is that there's no average tom when it comes to responding to hunting pressure. There's some birds don't really appear to change their behavior at all, and some birds dramatically change their behavior, and everything in between. Yeah. What we do see pretty uniformly is as hunting pressure increases, gobbling activity decreases, and sometimes it's dramatic. So heavily hunted birds, once hunting gets going, think a week into the season, gobbling is starting to decline literally on a daily basis and may get to very low levels where birds are gobbling either not at all or they're gobbling very little in the tree and they're not gobbling on the ground at all.
Yeah.
And that's just a response. There's two things going on there. One, in some cases, we're shooting the vocal birds.
Right.
And in other cases, the birds that aren't shot are changing how they're behaving. They're not gobbling as much.
Yeah.
And that's just a response to risk. They perceive risk and they change their behavior accordingly, which, research has shown that in white-tailed deer, elk, sheep, a lot of species. And it makes sense. They're wired to reproduce and survive. And if there's something that causes risk to that survival, then they have to react to it. Otherwise,
sure,
they're dead. So that's kind of what we see. Individual, it's highly variable. At a population level, you see pretty significant declines in gobbling activity as your hunting pressure gets higher.
Yeah. You know, you've done research and you've talked a lot about how hunting could disrupt, kind of the turkey pecking order, or I think you call it the dominance hierarchy or something like that. Could you talk about that a little bit? Because I think maybe that's one thing that not all hunters quite understand. Like, to us, it's like, all right, well, how does hunting affect turkeys? Well, we're killing a certain amount of them. And as long as we don't kill too many, then we should be fine. I think that's how the very most basic way of looking at, hunting and turkey population dynamics kind of gets talked about. But there's a lot more to it than that, isn't there?
Yes. And largely how agencies have looked at turkey harvest historically was, okay, as long as we don't shoot more than a certain percentage, we're fine.
Yeah.
But researchers, if you look at the science, birds that have dominance hierarchies have them for a reason. There's a reason that turkeys and other species that have dominance hierarchies have them, and that is status matters, rank matters. If you watch turkeys and the way they behave, these hierarchies dictate their life in every aspect, whether it's who gets to eat what. I mean, you watch a flock of birds that are walking around and somebody finds something to eat, everybody's over there, and often fights erupt. And it's because dominance matters.
Yeah.
And in turkeys, we know that dominant hens breed first, and that makes sense. Socially dominant animals get to breed first with dominant toms. That makes sense. Dominant toms matter. I mean, I think most turkey hunters would agree that dominance is in place. You see toms that are clearly dominant.
Without a doubt. Yeah.
Well, if you think carefully about that, whether you disagree with this or not, why is dominance there to begin with? And it's because there are some animals that are better than others. And that's why species that have dominance hierarchies, that's why they're so important, because dominance matters. If you're a dominant male, you're going to breed more. And this has been shown with turkeys and many, many other species. Dominant toms breed more than subordinate toms, as it should be. The dominant toms are aggressive. They're more fit. They research, and this is not my research. I'm citing work from decades ago. They're more fit. They are more aggressive. They have longer snoods and more colorful heads. They have more iridescence. They're just better. And hens can perceive that, and that's who they breed with, as they should. What we don't understand is how removing those dominant toms at a particular part of the breeding season, what does that do, if anything? And I've talked about this on a lot of podcasts. If we go in and remove one dominant bird from a property early, and the other, however many dominant birds in that population are not affected, then it may have very little effect. But given what we just talked about, if you were to envision a scenario where you would go into a population and remove a lot of dominant toms early, then logically it could matter.
Right.
We just don't understand the magnitude of that effect. But if you look at other species that have been studied, and this is a hard question to answer with turkeys, because we don't see who is dominant a lot of times. We just go out there and we interact with a bird or two, but we don't really know what's going on out there.
Right. We don't know every tom and kind of where he stands on that property or in that area.
That's right. But with species that you can see that also have dominance hierarchies, like prairie chickens, for instance.
Okay.
Prairie chickens, they'll end up in a spot, all the males are there together, it's clear who the dominant, you can just, with your own eyes, you can see those 4 males right there. Those are the 4 dominant males in this group. And the hens come to those dominant birds. Research has clearly shown if you go in and start picking some of those dominant birds out of that population, that it affects reproduction at the population level. And what the effect was, the hens kind of slow down what they're doing, because those fittest birds, the showiest, the prettiest, the most aggressive, however you want to look at it, they're gone now.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, like when we started this conversation, dominance matters. So if you're a hen, why would you breed with a subordinate male?
Right.
If there are dominant males there, you need to breed with them because they're dominant for a reason.
Right.
And if they disappear, it makes sense. From an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense to slow down, go check these males again, and figure out who's best out there, because it's going to matter to your own reproductive success.
Right. So the thing kind of has to restart. The hen has to kind of reassess. There's no clear, like, okay, that is obviously the dominant tom because he's killed or taken out. So now she has to kind of reassess the population of toms around her and try to figure out, all right, which one is the most dominant. And it may not be clear now if there's just a bunch of, kind of subdominant toms on the landscape. Is that basically the picture?
That's my hypothesis based on looking at data on prairie chickens and fallow deer and other species that use the same type, that have dominance hierarchies, that use the same type of mating system that turkeys use. And if so, the ultimate question becomes, okay, well, first of all, how many can you take if you take them early? What percentage? Right. And if that number's really low, then what point do you need to wait to start removing them? And honestly, we've known the answer to that for 40 years. There's research back in the 1980s showing, hey, if you want to time a turkey season the most conservative to most conservatively that you can, you open it when most of your breeding is already finished.
Right.
And most of your breeding is already finished when hens go to nest. Because at that point, they're not receptive to being bred.
Right.
Which is why you see some states like, for instance, Pennsylvania. They've opened their season early May for decades. And that's because their own data suggests that that's when a lot of nesting is starting. And at that point, some percentage of the toms, regardless of who they are, whether they're dominant or not, they can be removed. And things will sort themselves out by next year. But for this year, if we wait until this point, then as long as we don't kill too many in the population, who they are is largely irrelevant.
Yeah.
And that's what the research has shown for decades. It's just that in a lot of cases, people never heard that research.
Right.
And never, me or somebody like me in the last handful of years may have been the first time they ever heard that logic. But that logic has been there for decades.
Yeah.
And if you talk to agency biologists, in fact, an older guy that just recently retired has been a turkey biologist his entire career. And he came up to me a couple of years ago. It was actually a year and a half ago, right as we were getting out of the COVID fog and we were starting to meet with each other. We saw each other at a meeting, and he said, Mike, I just want to tell you how interesting I think it is that so many people are now suddenly talking about, dominant birds, and why we need to be thinking about what we're doing a little more carefully. We need to challenge ourselves. You can't keep doing the same thing if you have concerns and expect something different to happen. And he said, the funny thing is, we were talking about that in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And I was like, I wasn't even here. I was in high school in the 1980s. And he said, I'm telling you, every meeting we went to, we all talked about it.
Yeah.
And now fast forward 40 years and we're talking about it again.
Yeah. Well, probably. I mean, you can definitely answer this better than I, but probably one of the reasons why it wasn't talked about, because turkey populations were doing so good, right?
That's right.
You could shoot a bunch of toms in lots of different states. There are turkeys everywhere, turkeys popping up in places that they hadn't been in a long time. And it didn't really seem like there needed to be as much maybe nuance in what birds were killing. Or how many, as now it definitely seems like there needs to be, so kind of based on that idea, like, would you say that it's very possible that in some of these places where we're feeling wild turkey population declines, that we've either overpressured or over harvested turkeys?
I think that's certainly possible. If you look at the historical data that was largely used to make recommendations for seasons, bag limits, and timing. Basically, that work suggested that we need to kill 30% or less of our toms each year if we want to ensure quality hunting.
Mm-hmm.
And what I try to explain to people is that 30% was predicated on production that was twice as high as what we see now.
Right.
We were making a lot more birds then. And we routinely in our populations, in fact, before you and I got on this call, one of my postdocs was sitting here in my office talking about an analysis he's doing with 600 plus males that we've tracked over the years. And we see harvest from 30 to 40%, 50% in some populations.
Wow.
That's just not sustainable. And, I don't like hearing that any more than you do or anyone else does, because I was a turkey hunter long before I was a turkey scientist. And at the end of the day, I live for the spring. In my neck of the woods, it's spring and turkeys are gobbling and I want to go. I'm ready to go. Right. And I've got my trips planned and I'm ready. I'm ready to call a turkey up and shoot him.
Yeah.
Me facing the realization that changes have occurred, it's hard for me to accept that. But what I hope people will understand is the last few years you've seen season changes in a lot of states.
Yes.
Across the South, even Ohio, Nebraska, Missouri, South Carolina, Oklahoma, Kansas. I mean, these changes are widespread. But conversations about those changes have been ongoing for years. They didn't just start 2 years ago. Those conversations have been ongoing because these declines have been ongoing. So what you're seeing agencies do, which is not popular, as we know with a lot of hunters, is they're changing the one thing they can control at a state level, which is how they manage turkeys and other game species. And that only thing they can control at a statewide level is harvest.
Yeah.
So that's what they change.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it does get really tricky because, the people who love these turkeys the most or love this species the most are the ones ultimately who are going to have, some of the hardship for managing them fall on them. Like there may have to be more restraint, for the passion, which, yeah, like you said, that's not what people want to hear. But just, kind of from where you sit, what are ways that hunters, who accept that reality, what are some ways that they can help? What are some ways that they can kind of help this situation?
I think it starts, and this sounds so cliche and I get it. Keep buying that license. Mm-hmm. Keep buying that turkey stamp in your state. Keep supporting your state agency. That's the easiest thing you can continue to do is keep buying that hunting license, because that puts money in states' coffers.
Mm-hmm.
2, if you have access to private land, even if you don't own it, mm-hmm. It doesn't matter if it's 1 acre or 10,000 acres. Try to positively affect something that's occurring on that land that would benefit turkeys, like what we've talked about, being able to see, disturbing the forest, burning, mulching, disking, anything that disturbs the ground and stimulates green vegetation. Think outside the box. Maybe you don't own the land, but maybe you could convince your buddy's aunt who does own the land to do something. What I find a lot is that landowners don't realize what resources are out there to help them manage their land.
That's true.
And that's a failure on our part. That's a failure on us collectively.
Yeah.
To tell people what's out there. These cost share programs and these things that can be tapped into to either offset or in some cases completely cover the cost of doing some of these improvements on your land. Anything that you can do to affect an acre. If every person that picked up a gun pick a state, in your state of Minnesota, if every person that picked up a gun and chased a turkey made it imperative that for every time they did that, they were going to try to affect an acre of land, just 1 acre of land. Think about the impact you'd have.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be massive.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be that costly. It doesn't have to be, at the scale that, and I get in conversations with people and they get frustrated, and I understand it because they ask, okay, well, let's say, for instance, I own 50 acres of hardwoods with a field. If I did some timber stand improvements and I maintained that field in a perennial clover plot that turkeys would use, I see turkeys out there all the time, would that be helpful? Absolutely. But just understand that those turkeys are using 2,000 acres. And that will often then fall back on the person saying, oh, man, that's so frustrating,
Yeah.
And I tell people, don't quit doing what you're doing. More importantly, try to get your neighbor, try to get your buddy that has he has a property down the road that he hunts that's 50 acres. See if he'd be or she'd be willing to do anything comparable to benefit the bird. If we all that shot them would take it upon ourselves to impact an acre, it would move the needle.
Yeah. How about on the hunting side? Should those of us who are concerned and want to help the situation, should we look at hunting later in the season? Should we avoid trying to kill those dominant toms? Say your season opens April 1 or opens early. Should you kind of hold off till later in the season?
I think ultimately it depends on the rate of harvest. And what I mean by that is, if you're the only hunting pressure on your population of birds, and you're practicing restraint and you're killing a very small percentage of the birds anyway, then when you kill them is probably largely irrelevant.
Yeah.
But that's just not the scenario we're seeing in most populations. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I mean, I know properties in Texas, for instance, that get so little hunting pressure and the harvest rates are literally single-digit percentages that
it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter when you kill that few of birds. But just understand, if you're hunting like most of us, you're either hunting public land or you're hunting private land that's in smaller, several hundred acres, which doesn't seem small, but a turkey's home range is much larger than that.
Right.
That you're sharing your birds with other neighbors. So you really need to understand what other people are harvesting in your area to be able to predict an appropriate harvest on your end. Perfect scenario, this is a true scenario. A friend of mine he had 8 toms on that he was seeing routinely on 3,200 acres of land, which is not a lot of birds.
Right.
But he had pictures of these 8 toms consistently. They were seeing them all over the property, same 8 birds, and they decided to kill 2 of them. And this was COVID year, this is 2020. One of their neighbors killed another one of those same 8, and they learned this as the season was progressing. They started talking with each other. Yeah, those same birds were coming to a food plot on our property. Yeah, those same 8 birds. They ended up killing 7 of the 8.
Oh man, yeah. But on their piece, they only killed 2, which they thought was like, oh, this is good,
And they were thinking, and then their neighbors were thinking the same thing, that
we only killed 1. So
in fact, one of the neighbors, I talked to the neighbor, said, yeah, we had decided we're going to kill 1. It doesn't matter who it is, the first one we can kill, and whoever kills it, that's fine. That it's going to shut the rest of us down for the season, and we're good with that. But then collectively, you put those 4 different landowners together, and they shot 7 of the 8 birds.
Yeah.
And I know for a fact last year they only had 3 birds, and they shut the properties down because they were concerned about having the same scenario play out. So I think it ultimately depends on what's going on in the neighborhood, and that's hard to understand sometimes. Neighbors may not want to tell you what they're doing, and
it's also hard to just decide not to hunt your property.
I know,
or even if it's not yours, to just not hunt a property you have access to. But that makes a lot of sense.
It undermines everything that we're about. It goes against every fiber of a turkey hunter's being to say, I'm not going to hunt that property that I've hunted, let's say, for the last 5 years. It just goes against everything that is natural.
Oh, man. Especially if you hear one gobbling that evening. How do you walk away from that?
I know.
But it does make sense just from a management standpoint. And I think, I really do think that there are enough turkey hunters out there that are concerned. And I'm talking, these days there's a handful in every area of real serious turkey hunters who will be able to kill their bird or a couple birds each season, and that's not an issue for them. They're good hunters, and they have the ground, and they know how to do it. I think there are more and more of those folks who are now concerned because they've seen the declines, and they know that they can kill them still, but they don't like to see a declining population in all the places that they typically hunt.
I agree with you. I know I have close friends that are as good a turkey hunter as you're going to find in this country. That it doesn't matter if there's 10 toms out there or 3. If the bag limit's 3, they can kill them.
They'll get all 3. Yeah.
And I know some of those people have changed the way they are behaving, and others have not. And ultimately, I understand, one argument is, well, we need to change the way we're behaving because we need to address this issue that we're clearly seeing. And then the other mindset is, well, if the state tells me that I can do this legally, and then I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And ultimately, what that does is it puts turkey hunters in a contentious argument, a debate.
It does.
So all that does is it undermines us as a group, and it jeopardizes our fabric, if you will. It really, and that's not a positive. So ultimately, it hinges on states taking the initiative and implementing harvest strategies that make sense biologically.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a dream scenario, right? Like the states can figure out the regulatory part, and then hunters can go back to focusing on the stuff that we're good at, which is habitat and the conservation elements of it, raising money.
Yeah, and the agencies, I don't envy state agencies at all. I have close friends that are high-level biologists in a number of states, and they have a tough job. They are trying. They're mandated with ensuring sustainable populations, and they're also subjected to political pressures and social pressures, and in a lot of these states, politics drive decision making. It trumps biology in a lot of situations, and that puts agencies in tough situations where they make changes, and those changes, in some cases, are not popular with many hunters, and they're not popular with the politics. And it just, like you said, in an ideal world, states would have, I call it the social license, if you will, that we give them the flexibility. lay off their backs, quit complaining them, and let them do what they think is biologically the best, and we would just live with it.
Yeah.
But that's just not reality.
No, that's not how government works.
That's not how social media works either.
No, it's not. The last thing I want to ask you about, because I think this part's really cool. You're working with Mossy Oak to create and populate a website that shows a lot of the best and most interesting research out there, kind of all in one place for turkey hunters and people who are interested in turkey populations to kind of, get it all in one website. Would you talk a little bit about that and what that is going to do?
Yeah. So it started off as an effort just for me personally to pay to have a website set up that would be like a repository for my own research. And so my original idea was, okay, let's create a website where someone could access the research articles I've published in my career. And maybe they could read a layman's summary of, here's what we did, here's what we found, and here's why you care, type of thing. And that site would include my social media posts, kind of like an archive, of what I've done in my career. And I paid to have it set up, and I realized that it was going to cost, more.
Yeah.
I could get it set up, but I couldn't maintain it. I actually approached Mossy Oak, who I have a very close relationship, both professionally and personally, and said, hey, folks, would you be willing to share a little bit of the cost here to help me out? I think it could be mutually beneficial. Mossy Oak as a company is solely invested in wild turkeys. They're passionate about wild turkeys. It's kind of the heart of their company, if you will. And so that conversation went from, would you help support this, to them saying, Mike, we would be honored to fully support this. And that has now morphed into the, wildturkeylab.com is this site that's changing by the day. It's one of Mossy Oak's brands now. It's, their commitment to science. And now we have been able to expand it. I'm going to have, links to all of the different podcasts I've done. I'm going to have a tab that's a historical archive where I can include pictures and very brief write-ups of earlier researchers that came well before me that did really cool, impactful work that most people have no idea even exist. And I'm going to archive that with pictures and eye appeal, if you will, to summarize the history of turkey research and what it told us and what it hasn't told us, what we still don't know. And what I want it to be is, in many ways, a one-stop shop for if you're interested in anything I've done, if you're interested in things that have been done historically that were impactful, that were really groundbreaking pieces of work. You can go to this site and click on the search engine and find it. And it's going to take me some time to get the content up there. It's changing by the day, but I'm excited about it. I think people are going to enjoy it. And honestly, man, I'm long in the tooth in the academic world, and I only have a handful of years left, and then I want to walk away from this and do something else. I have some other personal things I want to take care of, and when I walk away, I want there to be a place that shows the 35 years that I've studied this bird. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful. Try to end this podcast on a positive note. There's a lot of good and hard work done to put this bird back on the landscape. And I think there's that same passion there still among hunters and researchers and conservationists to keep them there.
For sure. We've been down this road before. We've faced significant challenges with turkeys before, and we overcame those challenges, but we're just looking at different challenges now.
Yeah.
It's that simple, although it's very complex.
Yeah.
We're just looking at a different set of challenges that are going to require a different set of solutions, if you will. But the solutions are there. We just have to move in that direction.
The Outdoor Life podcast is edited and produced by me, Executive Editor Natalie Krebs. It's hosted by our Editor-in-Chief, Alex Robinson. Music in this episode was composed and performed by Matthew Kang and Simon William Charterton via APM Music. Sound effects were courtesy of the National Park Service and freesound.org. In the next episode of the podcast, we pull back the curtain on the 2023 Outdoor Life Gun Test.